The sound of a champagne cork popping usually signals a celebration, a new beginning. For me, Victor, it sounded like a gunshot that ended my life. I stood there, a crystal glass raised in my trembling hand, looking out at the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline from the penthouse I had purchased with 40 years of sweat and calculation. It was New Year's Eve, 11:20 at night. I cleared my throat, ready to hand my son Preston an envelope containing the deed to my summer cabin, the last asset I had kept in my name. I took a breath to speak, to tell him how proud I was. But before a single word could leave my lips, a glossy brochure slid across the Italian marble dining table. It hit my wineglass with a sharp cling. I looked down. It was an advertisement for Shady Oaks, a state-funded nursing home known for bedsores and neglect. I looked up, confused, meeting the icy stare of my daughter-in-law, Tiffany. "Dad," she said, her voice cutting through the jazz music like a serrated knife. "It is 2024. Look around. This penthouse, this lifestyle, it requires maintenance. It needs space for people who are actually creating value." I looked at my son. Preston, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man whose college tuition I paid by working double shifts, was staring at his plate. He was twisting his napkin, unable to meet my eyes. Tiffany took a sip of her drink and smiled, a cruel, tight expression. "You are expired, Victor. You are taking up space. We packed your bag. The Uber is 5 minutes out." Expired. The word hung in the air. I looked at the brochure again. I looked at the walls I had paid for, the food I had bought. I realized then that I wasn't a father to them anymore. I was an obstacle. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I simply placed the envelope with the cabin deed back into my jacket pocket. If you have ever been betrayed by the very people you sacrificed everything for, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss how I turned this night of despair into a lesson they will never forget. And tell me in the comments, what is the coldest thing a family member has ever said to you? I walked past Tiffany without a word. I went to the guest room, which was already being converted into a yoga studio. My things were not there. Just one old battered suitcase near the door. I opened it. They had thrown in some old clothes, but not my warm coat. I reached for the only thing that mattered, a framed photograph of my late wife, Eleanor, sitting on the nightstand. I tucked it under my arm. Preston finally looked up as I walked to the front door. "Dad," he whispered, his voice weak. "It's just for a while. Until you get settled." I didn't answer. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the hallway. The elevator ride down 40 floors felt like a descent into hell. When the doors opened to the lobby, the doorman, a man I had tipped generously for years, looked away. They had already warned him. I walked out of the building, and the heavy brass doors clicked shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my bones. It was 11:30 at night, and Chicago was screaming. The wind off Lake Michigan was not just air moving at high speed. It was a physical assault, a wall of ice that slammed into my chest and stole the breath from my lungs. The doorman, a man named Eddie, who I had tipped $500 every Christmas for the last 10 years, stared intently at the marble floor as I passed. He knew. They had already called down. I was no longer a resident. I was a trespasser. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a relentless vibration against my frozen thigh. It was the Uber notification. Preston had called it, likely to assuage his own guilt, a digital way of saying he had not completely thrown me to the wolves. I pulled the phone out, my fingers stiff and clumsy. I stared at the screen, at the little car icon inching toward my location. I hit cancel. I did not want their charity. I did not want their pity ride to some flea-bag motel where they could forget about me in comfort. I wanted the cold. I needed the cold. I wanted the freeze to seep through my thin suit jacket and numb the fire of betrayal that was currently incinerating my heart. I began to walk. My dress shoes, Italian leather soles designed for boardrooms and carpets, had zero traction on the ice-slicked pavement. I slipped, stumbled, and caught myself on a frozen lamppost. I was 72 years old, walking into a blizzard with nothing but a suitcase full of old clothes and a picture frame tucked under my arm. The snow was falling horizontally, blinding sheets of white that erased the world a few feet in front of me. I lowered my head and pushed forward. Each step was a battle. Each gust of wind was a reminder that I was now part of the debris of this city, something to be swept away by the storm. I walked for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 20 minutes. My destination was the Greyhound bus station, the only place that would be open, the only place that would take cash, the only place where a man with no future could sit without being asked to leave. As I turned the corner onto Wacker Drive, I found myself standing in front of a massive construction site. It was a skeleton of steel and concrete rising up into the darkness covered in snow and silence. I stopped. The wind howled around the exposed girders, creating a mournful, hollow sound. I wiped the snow from my eyelashes and looked up. To anyone else passing by, if there were any other souls foolish enough to be out in this weather. This was just another unfinished skyscraper, a jagged scar on the skyline. But to me it was a mirror. 40 years ago I stood on this exact corner. The pavement was different than cracked and uneven. I was 32, ambitious, with a roll of blueprints under my arm and a mind that saw the world in vectors and loads. I was the lead structural engineer for the foundation of the building right next door to this one. I remembered the sleepless nights, the coffee stains on the drafting paper, the terrifying responsibility of calculating the load-bearing capacity for the pylons. I had spent weeks checking the math on the soil density, ensuring that thousands of tons of steel and glass would not sink into the swampy Chicago earth. I ensured that thousands of people would be safe, that they could work and live and sleep 80 stories in the air, held up by my calculations. I reached out and touched the cold, corrugated metal of the construction fence. My hand was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the memory of who I used to be. I was essential then. I was foundational. I built this city. My mind had value. My hands created stability. And now I stood at the foot of my own creation, homeless, freezing, cast aside like a rusted bolt. The irony was so bitter I could taste it, metallic and sharp like blood in my mouth. I wasn't just expired, as Tiffany had said. I was erased. I pushed myself away from the fence. Standing here remembering glory days wouldn't keep me warm. I continued my trudge toward the station. The city lights blurred through the snow, distant and uncaring. I saw people in the windows of restaurants laughing, eating, raising toasts to the new year. They looked like a different species, creatures of warmth and light, while I had become a creature of the dark and the cold. When the neon sign of the Greyhound station finally emerged from the whiteout, it looked less like a beacon of hope and more like the entrance to purgatory. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, and the heat hit me, not a pleasant warmth, but a thick, suffocating wave of stale air. The station smelled of wet wool, industrial floor cleaner, stale tobacco, and deep, abiding desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing flicker, casting a sickly green pallor over everything. This was the place people came when they had run out of options. There were no travelers here, only refugees from their own lives. People sat hunched over on the hard plastic seats, guarding their bags with jealous eyes. No one looked at anyone else. Eye contact here was a currency no one could afford to spend. I found a bench in the far corner, away from the drafty entrance, but close enough to the wall to feel like I had something solid behind me. I sat down heavily. My knees popped, a painful reminder of the miles I had just walked. I placed my battered suitcase between my legs and wrapped the leather strap around my ankle twice. It was a habit from a lifetime ago, from my days traveling to job sites in rough neighborhoods. You secure your assets, even if your assets are now just a change of underwear and a dead wife's photo. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. It was a nice wallet, a gift from Preston 3 Christmases ago, leather monogrammed. Now it felt like a prop from a play that had closed. I opened it and counted the cash. I had left my credit cards at the penthouse. They were linked to the family trust, and I knew Tiffany would track them. If I bought a coffee, she would get a notification. I would not give her the satisfaction of tracking my decline. $42. 3 tens, 2 fives, and 2 ones. I smoothed the bills out on my knee. $42. Yesterday, this was less than I would tip a waiter for opening a bottle of wine. Today, it was my entire net worth. It was breakfast. It was a bus ticket to nowhere. It was survival. I stared at the face of Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill and felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest, a hysterical, jagged thing that I had to swallow back down. I checked the large analog clock on the wall. 11:55. 5 minutes to midnight. 5 minutes to a new year. In the penthouse, the champagne was flowing. Preston was probably making a toast, stumbling over his words, looking for approval from his wife. Tiffany was smiling that shark-like smile, thinking about the yoga studio she would build in my room. They were celebrating the future. I was sitting in a bus station counting crumbled bills, celebrating the fact that I hadn't frozen to death. I closed my eyes. I tried to summon Eleanor's face. I wanted to hear her voice the way she used to whisper that everything would be okay when the work stress got too high. But I couldn't hear her. The noise of the station, the hum of the vending machines, the distant wail of a siren, it all drowned her out. All I could hear was Tiffany's voice cutting through the jazz music. Expired. Suddenly a sound broke through my dark reverie. It wasn't the drunken cheers of New Year's revelers. It was a sob. A raw, wet, jagged sound of pure panic. I opened my eyes. I hadn't noticed her sit down, but there she was right next to me on the bench. She was young, maybe 20 years old. She was wearing a thin university hoodie that was soaked through with melted snow. She was shivering violently, her entire body vibrating with cold and shock. Her face was buried in her hands, and her shoulders shook with every breath she took. I looked around. A security guard was leaning against a pillar 50 feet away, scrolling on his phone. A man 2 rows over was sleeping with a newspaper over his face. No one else cared. In a place like this, misery was just background noise. It was the soundtrack of the station. I hesitated. I was tired. I was broken. I had my own tragedy to nurse. I didn't have the energy to care about a stranger. But then I looked at the framed photo of Eleanor tucked into the side pocket of my suitcase. She would never ignore a crying child. She would have crossed a highway to help a stray dog. I couldn't be the man Tiffany said I was. I couldn't be expired. I had to be Victor. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit and pulled out a handkerchief. It was clean pressed monogrammed silk, one of the few true luxuries I had left. I leaned over slightly. "Miss," I said, my voice raspy from the cold air. She jumped her head, snapping up. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She looked at me, an old man in a snow-covered expensive suit, holding out a square of white silk in a dirty bus station. She flinched as if she expected me to yell at her. "I am not going to hurt you," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "You look like you need this more than I do." She stared at the handkerchief, then at my face. She saw something there, perhaps the exhaustion, perhaps the shared defeat that made her lower her guard. She took the cloth, her hands trembling so hard she almost dropped it. She wiped her eyes, smearing the black makeup, and took a shuddering, hitching breath. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was thin and brittle. I nodded. "It is almost midnight. It is a hard time to be crying in a bus station." She let out a dry, humorless laugh that turned into a choke. "It is the worst time. I just lost everything." I raised an eyebrow, feeling a familiar echo in my own chest. Everything I was waiting for. The 11 o'clock bus back to campus, she stammered, fresh tears welling up in her red-rimmed eyes. I was so tired. I fell asleep for just a minute, maybe two. When I woke up, my backpack was gone. She looked at the empty space on the floor in front of her as if wishing the bag back into existence. My wallet was in there. My ID, my bus ticket, my laptop. She looked at me, then her eyes pleading for someone to understand the magnitude of her disaster. I am an architecture student, she sobbed. My final thesis project is on that laptop. It is due in 2 days. I don't have a backup. If I don't turn it in, I fail. I lose my scholarship. It is my whole future. It is gone. And I don't even have $1 to use the payphone to call my mom. I looked at her, Mia. She said her name was Mia. She was an architecture student, a builder, just like I used to be. She dealt in foundations and structures. She had lost her tools, her money, her path. She was sitting at zero, staring into an abyss of failure that wasn't even her fault. I felt the $42 in my pocket. It was lunch money. It was survival money. It was nothing compared to the millions I had signed away, but it was everything I had in the world right now. I looked at the station clock. The second hand was sweeping toward the 12. 10 seconds to midnight. I thought about my son, Preston. I had given him millions. I had given him a penthouse, an education, a life of ease. And he gave me betrayal. He gave me the cold. Here was a stranger, a girl who built things, who had lost it all in a moment of vulnerability. 3 seconds. 2. 1. Happy New Year, I whispered to the empty air. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills. I didn't know it then, but this moment, this decision to look outward instead of inward, was about to change the trajectory of my entire life. I held out the crumbled bills to her, but she did not take them. She just stared at the money in my open palm as if it were a foreign currency she did not know how to spend. Her shivering had subsided into a low, rhythmic trembling that shook the bench we shared. I realized then that money was too abstract for the level of shock she was in. She needed something immediate. She needed fuel. I reached into the deep pocket of my overcoat. I had packed a sandwich earlier that evening, a simple turkey on rye wrapped in wax paper. It was supposed to be my lunch for the train ride I never took, or perhaps a midnight snack after the party I was kicked out of. I unwrapped it slowly. The smell of the rye bread seemed impossibly wholesome in the stale air of the bus station. I broke it in half. Eat, I said, extending the half sandwich to her. You cannot think when your blood sugar is crashing, and you look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. She looked at the sandwich, then at my face. Her survival instinct overrode her politeness. She took it and bit into it ravenously. I ate my half in silence, watching the station clock tick past midnight. The new year had officially begun. There were no fireworks here, just the sound of a distant janitor dragging a mop bucket across the linoleum floor. Between bites, she started to talk. It was a nervous, rapid-fire rambling, the kind people do when they are trying to keep the terror at bay. She told me about her architecture program. She told me about the pressure, the sleepless nights, the professors who seemed to enjoy crushing dreams. It was called the Infinity Bridge, she said, wiping a crumb from her lip. That was my thesis project. I spent 6 months on the modeling. It was a single-span suspension design that looked like it was floating on water. She let out a defeated sigh that seemed to deflate her entire small frame. Professor Holloway failed it before I even finished the presentation. He laughed at me. He said the load distribution was a fantasy. He said it was structurally impossible, and that I was designing cartoons, not buildings. He told me to switch majors to graphic design. I stopped chewing. Structurally impossible. Those were 2 words that had always sounded like a challenge to me, not a verdict. I looked at her. Do you have a pencil? I asked. She blinked, confused by the shift in my tone. I think so. In my pocket. She dug into her jeans and pulled out a yellow pencil. It was blunt, the eraser chewed down to the metal band. It was the tool of a student who was stressed and overworked. I took it. It felt small in my hand, but familiar. It felt like a weapon I knew how to use. I looked around for paper. The floor was littered with trash. I reached down and picked up a discarded flyer. It was an advertisement for a payday loan shark promising quick cash for exorbitant interest. I flipped it over. The back was blank, a field of white space waiting to be filled. I placed the paper on my suitcase, using the hard shell as a desk. Show me, I said. Sketch the basic arc. Mia hesitated, but then she leaned in. She took the pencil from my hand for a moment and drew a quick, sweeping curve. It was elegant. It was ambitious. I saw immediately why she loved it. It was beautiful. But I also saw immediately why it would fall down. I took the pencil back. I did not look at her. I looked at the line. My eyes narrowed. For the first time in 12 hours, I was not Victor, the homeless old man. I was Victor, the ghost architect. The world around me faded. The smell of the bus station vanished. I saw vectors. I saw gravity. I saw the invisible forces that pull everything toward the earth. You are trying to support the weight from the center, I muttered, my hand moving across the paper. I drew rapid, sharp lines over her soft curves. The graphite scratched against the cheap paper. I sketched a cross-section of the bridge's belly. I calculated the tension in my head, doing math that usually required a computer. It was muscle memory. 40 years of physics flowed through my fingertips. See here, I said, my voice gaining strength. The professor is right about the distribution, but he is looking at it like a static load. He is thinking in concrete and steel beams. I pressed harder, darkening the lines at the anchor points. You are not wrong in the design, I said, looking her in the eye. You are wrong in the materials. She leaned closer, her breath hitching. What do you mean? I pointed the pencil tip at the critical failure point I had identified in her sketch. If you use standard steel here, the shear force will snap it in high winds. The bridge collapses. That is why he failed you. But look, I drew a series of thin internal lines running through the main arch. If you use pre-stressed cable at this point buried inside the concrete composite, you change the tension profile. You turn the weakness into a spring. It absorbs the load instead of fighting it. I looked up at her, my eyes blazing with the intensity that had once commanded boardrooms. If you use pre-stressed cable at this point, the bridge will stand for 100 years. It is not impossible. It is just advanced. Mia stared at the drawing. She looked at the math I had scrawled in the margins. Equations that defined torque and resistance. She looked at the way I had corrected the geometry of her dream, making it real, making it stand up. Then her eyes drifted to my hand, specifically to my right pinky finger. I was wearing a ring. It was not a gold wedding band. It was a simple, rough band of iron. It was faceted, beaten, and worn smooth by decades of wear. It was the iron ring, the symbol of the Order of the Engineer. It was a ring given only to those who had sworn the oath to uphold the highest standards of the profession, a reminder of the humility and responsibility of a builder. Mia's eyes went wide. She looked from the ring to the drawing and then to my face. She saw the stubble on my chin, the exhaustion in my eyes, but she also saw the way I held the pencil. She saw the specific, unique shorthand I used for the calculations. "Oh my God," she whispered. She reached into her pocket again, but this time she didn't pull out a pencil. She pulled out a cracked smartphone. She had told me she lost her phone, but she must have meant she had no service, or perhaps she had hidden it. She tapped the screen frantically, her fingers flying. She opened a photo gallery. She scrolled past pictures of friends and parties until she found an old scanned image. She zoomed in. It was a photo of a blueprint. an old blue-lined architectural drawing of a skyscraper foundation. In the bottom corner there was a signature, and next to it, a distinct set of handwritten calculations. She held the phone up next to the flyer I had just drawn on. The handwriting was identical. The way the sevens were crossed. The sharp, angular way the arrows were drawn. She looked at me, her mouth open in shock. "My father," she stammered, her voice shaking. "My father is the Dean of Architecture at MIT. He has a framed set of blueprints in his study. He calls them the Holy Grail of modern structural engineering. He told me the man who drew them was a ghost, a legend who retired and vanished." She looked at my iron ring again. "He told me that man taught him everything he knows about integrity." She hit the call button on her phone. It was a video call. She held it up, aiming the camera at me, at the old man in the dirty suit sitting in a Greyhound station at midnight. The screen connected. A man's face appeared groggy, wearing reading glasses, sitting in a home office lined with books. "Dad," Mia said, her voice breaking. "You are not going to believe who is sitting next to me." The man on the screen squinted. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at me, and then his eyes went wide, just like his daughter's. "Victor," the man on the screen whispered. "Victor Vance, is that you?" I looked at the screen. I recognized him. Decades ago, he was a junior draftsman on my team. A kid named Daniel who asked too many questions. Now he was a dean. "Hello, Daniel," I said, my voice rasping. "It has been a long time." Mia looked at me, tears streaming down her face again. But this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of disbelief. She had just found the one person in the world who could save her project, sitting on a bench in the middle of a blizzard. And I, Victor, the expired man, the debris of the city, realized that I had not been erased after all. I had been found. The video call connected with a digital chime that sounded too cheerful for the grim atmosphere of the bus station. I watched as the pixels settled, sharpening into the face of a man I had not seen in 30 years. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, deep lines etched around his eyes, but the intensity was the same. It was the face of the young draftsman who used to follow me around construction sites, notebook in hand, desperate to absorb every ounce of knowledge I was willing to spill. Mia held the phone with both hands, her knuckles white. She looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Her voice was trembling, not with cold this time, but with a kind of reverent hysteria. "Dad," she said, her breath fogging in the frigid air of the station. "Do you believe in ghosts?" the man on the screen. Dominic Valenti rubbed his eyes under his glasses. He looked confused, pulled from sleep or deep work. "What are you talking about, Mia?" "It is midnight. Are you okay?" "Where are you?" "I am at the Greyhound station," she said quickly, cutting off his fatherly concern. "But Dad, listen to me. I am sitting here with him. I am sitting with the ghost." She turned the phone slightly so the camera captured the flyer resting on my suitcase. The crude sketch of the bridge. The sharp, decisive lines of the cross-section. The complex equations scrawled in the margins with a blunt yellow pencil. "He just fixed the infinity bridge, Dad," she whispered. "He fixed the load distribution in 3 minutes. He used the prestige tension method. He drew it on the back of a loan shark flyer." Dominic leaned closer to his camera. I could see his eyes darting across the image on the screen. He was analyzing the sketch. I saw the moment the recognition hit him. It was like watching a physical blow land. His mouth opened slightly. He pulled his glasses off and pressed his face toward the lens. "Show me him," Dominic commanded. His voice was no longer groggy. It was sharp, urgent. "Show me his face." Mia turned the phone toward me. I instinctively recoiled. I pulled my coat collar up, trying to hide behind the grime and the shame. I did not want him to see me like this. I did not want the man who now ran the most prestigious architecture program in the country to see his former mentor reduced to a shivering, homeless old man in a stained suit. But the camera found me. I looked into the lens, trapped. Victor Dominic breathed. The sound was distorted by the phone speaker, but the shock was unmistakable. Victor Vance. My God. We thought you were dead. We thought you had moved to Europe. We have been looking for you for a decade. I looked away, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. I am not dead, Dominic, I muttered. Just retired. Retired, Dominic's voice rose an octave. You disappeared. You vanished into thin air. Victor, look at me. I slowly raised my eyes. Where have you been, he asked. And then he saw the background. He saw the harsh fluorescent lights, the sleeping vagrants, the snow melting off my shoulders. He saw the suitcase strapped to my leg. The realization washed over him, turning his face pale. Mia, he said, his voice shaking with a sudden, terrifying intensity. Where exactly are you? The downtown station, she said. Dominic stood up. I saw his chair fly backward and hit the bookshelf behind him. He was moving with a frantic energy. Do not let him go, he shouted. The volume made the security guard 50 feet away look up from his phone. Mia, listen to me, Dominic yelled, grabbing his car keys off his desk. Do not let him leave that bench. Do not let him out of your sight. I am coming. I am coming right now. The screen went black as he ended the call. Panic seized me. It was a cold, sharp grip in my gut. I misunderstood the urgency. My mind, battered by the betrayal of the last 24 hours, twisted his reaction. He was coming. Why to gawk, to save me? Or was he angry? Had I done something wrong by touching his daughter's work? Was he calling the police? Was he calling Preston? I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle the pity. I couldn't handle the idea of Daniel, my Daniel, seeing me beg for a sandwich. I needed to leave. I needed to disappear again. That was what I was good at now. Being invisible. I stood up abruptly. The motion made my head spin from hunger and exhaustion. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase. I have to go, I said, my voice raspy. Mia jumped up. She blocked my path. Her eyes were wide with panic. No, she said. You can't go. You heard him. He is coming. I cannot be here, I said, trying to step around her. I cannot do this. Tell your father. Tell him I am sorry. Tell him the bridge will work. I pushed past her, my shoes scuffing on the floor. I headed toward the glass doors, toward the blizzard. The cold outside seemed welcoming now. It offered anonymity. It offered an end to this humiliating exposure. Victor, please, Mia cried out. She grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She dug her fingers into the wool of my coat. Please don't leave me here, she begged. I stopped. I looked down at her. She wasn't just stopping me for her father. She was terrified. She was a young girl alone in a dangerous place at midnight with no phone battery left, no money, and no ticket. I had given her a blueprint, but I hadn't given her safety. I can't stay, I whispered, my resistance crumbling. I am a failure, Mia. Your father remembers a giant. He remembers a legend. If he sees me, if he sees this, it will destroy the memory. Let me stay a ghost. Mia shook her head, tears flying from her eyes. You are not a ghost, she said fiercely. You are the man who just saved my life. My dad isn't coming to judge you. He is coming because you are his hero. Please, just wait. 10 minutes. Give him 10 minutes. I looked at the doors. The snow was swirling violently against the glass. I looked at Mia. She was trembling, holding onto my arm as if I were the only solid thing in her world. I let out a long, ragged sigh. I couldn't leave her. Eleanor would never forgive me if I left a child alone in a storm. Fine, I said softly. 10 minutes. We sat back down. The minutes dragged like hours. The station grew colder as the night deepened. I stared at the clock, watching the second hand tick, tick, tick. Each second was a hammer blow to my anxiety. I straightened my tie. I tried to brush the dandruff and snow off my shoulders. I wanted to look dignified. I wanted to look like I was just waiting for a connection, not waiting for a rescue. 9 minutes passed. Then 12. Then 15. "He is not coming," I said, preparing to stand up again. "The weather is too bad. The roads are closed." The heavy glass doors of the bus station swung open. But this time, the gust of wind that followed did not carry the usual scent of exhaust and despair. It carried an aura of absolute power. 2 large men in dark overcoats stepped in first, their eyes scanning the room, with the practiced paranoia of professional security. They looked at the sleeping vagrants, the trash on the floor, and the flickering lights with disdain. But the man who walked in between them saw none of that. Dominic Valenti was a giant in the industry. I had seen his face on the covers of Forbes and Architectural Digest. He was 55 years old, in the prime of his power, wearing a tuxedo that cost more than the building we were sitting in. He should have looked out of place. He should have looked terrified to be in such a dive at midnight on New Year's Eve. But he didn't. He looked frantic. He scanned the room wildly until his eyes locked onto our bench. He saw Mia looking small and frightened. And then he saw me. He saw the gray hair, the slump of my shoulders, the worn-out shoes that were currently soaking in a puddle of melted snow. He didn't walk. He ran. He pushed past his own bodyguards, ignoring their protests. He crossed the dirty linoleum floor in seconds. I braced myself. I expected a handshake. I expected a look of pity. I expected him to stop a few feet away, maintaining the sanitary distance that the wealthy usually keep from the destitute. But Dominic Valenti did not stop. He reached the bench, and without a second of hesitation, he dropped. He didn't just kneel. He collapsed. He fell to his knees. He was right there on the gum-stained, grime-covered floor of the Greyhound station. He didn't care about the mud ruining his pants. He didn't care about the curious stares of the drug addicts and the drifters who had lifted their heads to watch the show. He reached out and wrapped his arms around my legs. He buried his face in the wet wool of my trousers, hugging my knees as if I were a long-lost father who had returned from the war. "Victor." He choked out, his voice cracking with an emotion so raw it silenced the entire station. "I found you. My God, I finally found you." I froze. I looked down at the top of his head, at his expensive haircut, now touching my dirty coat. I felt his shoulders shaking. This man who could order the construction of skyscrapers with a single phone call was weeping at my feet. "Get up, Daniel," I whispered, using the name I knew him by 40 years ago. "Please get up. You are ruining your suit." He looked up then. Tears were streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the exhaustion etched there. He didn't let go of my legs. "To hell with the suit," he said, his voice fierce. "Victor, do you have any idea how long we have looked for you, my father? My father died looking for you." I felt a pang in my chest. Dominic's father, Sal Valenti, had been a good man. A hard man, but fair. "He died 3 years ago," Dominic continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, but refusing to stand. "On his deathbed, he made me promise. He said, 'Do not stop until you find the ghost. Do not stop until you thank him.'" He took a breath, trying to steady himself. "Do you remember 1990, Victor? Do you remember the Millennium Tower project?" I nodded slowly. How could I forget? It was the project that was supposed to launch the Valenti Empire, but the geological surveys had been wrong. They hit a pocket of soft clay 50 feet down. The piles wouldn't hold. The banks were threatening to pull the funding. Bankruptcy wasn't just a possibility. It was a certainty. "We were finished," Dominic said, his voice echoing in the quiet station. Dad was in his office crying. He was writing his resignation letter. And then at 4 in the morning, a fax came through. Just one page. No cover letter. No invoice. Just a drawing. I remembered that night. I was working as a consultant for a rival firm, but I couldn't watch good men fail. I had stayed up all night doing the math that the computers of that era couldn't handle. I realized that if they used a helical screw pile design changing the friction coefficient, the clay would actually grip the foundation tighter as it settled. It was a counterintuitive solution. It was genius. "You sent the solution," Dominic said, looking at me with reverence. "You saved the company, Victor. That tower stands today because of you. We made $50 million on that project. And when we went to find you, to give you your share, you were gone. Your office was empty. Your house was sold. We heard rumors about the accident, about Eleanor. The name of my wife hung in the air between us. That was why I had left. Eleanor's accident had broken me in a way engineering couldn't fix. I had walked away from the accolades to be by her side, to hold her hand through the surgeries and the long, dark recovery that never really happened. I chose obscurity because glory felt hollow when she was in pain." "I had to go, Dominic," I said softly. "She needed me. The buildings didn't feel important anymore." Dominic nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He finally stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees without a care. He signaled to his security team. One of the massive guards stepped forward and gently picked up my battered suitcase as if it contained the nuclear codes. "You are not staying here," Dominic stated. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact. "The Valenti estate has a guest wing. It has been waiting for a guest of honor for 30 years. My father kept a bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti in the cellar. He said we would only open it when we found the ghost." He turned to Mia, who was still sitting on the bench, clutching her phone, staring at the scene with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. "And you," Dominic said, his voice softer now. "You brought him back to me. You are coming too. We will get your laptop back. My security team will find it before the sun comes up. Or we will buy you the most powerful computer NASA has. But tonight, nobody sleeps in a bus station." He extended his hand to me. I took it. His grip was warm and solid. He pulled me up not just from the bench, but from the depths of my own worthlessness. "Let's go home, Victor," he said. We walked toward the exit. The homeless people watched us go, their mouths open. They saw an old man in a shabby suit being escorted by a tycoon and his bodyguards like royalty. We stepped out into the blizzard, but the cold didn't bite anymore. The security team formed a human shield against the wind. The Rolls-Royce Phantom was waiting at the curb, its engine purring, a beast of comfort and safety. The driver opened the rear door. I slid onto the hand-stitched leather seat. It was warm. It smelled of expensive cedar and success. Mia slid in next to me, looking like she had been beamed onto a spaceship. Dominic sat opposite us. As the car pulled away, gliding silently over the snow-covered streets of Chicago, leaving the misery of the Greyhound station behind, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was bright in the dim ambient lighting of the car. It wasn't a call from Tiffany asking where I was. It wasn't an apology from Preston. It was a text message from my bank. Alert withdrawal processed. Location ATM O'Hare International Airport. Amount $500,000 honed. Remaining balance $0. Status account overdrawn. I stared at the glowing letters. Preston. He hadn't just kicked me out. He hadn't just taken the penthouse. He had accessed the joint account we shared for emergencies. He had taken the last $5,000 I had to my name, my funeral money, my survival money. He was at the airport. He was flying away to some vacation, using the last drops of my blood to pay for his first-class ticket. I looked up at Dominic, who was smiling at me, ready to give me the world. I was sitting in a $500,000 car, rescued by a man who thought I was a hero. But in that moment, staring at the zero balance on my phone. I realized the cruelest truth of the night. My student would die for me, but my son had just left me to starve. The silence in the elevator was absolute as we ascended toward the heavens. I watched the floor numbers tick upward in a digital blur, leaving the frozen streets of Chicago far below. I was standing in a box of glass and steel that rose through the very spine of the Valenti Tower, the building I had saved from sinking into the mud 3 decades ago. Dominic stood beside me, silent and respectful, while Mia leaned against the railing, her eyes wide as she watched the city shrink into a grid of lights and snow. When the doors slid open, we did not step into a hallway. We stepped directly into a sanctuary. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of limestone floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the blizzard from the safety of a fortress. It was warm here. The air smelled of cedar and old leather. It smelled of safety. Dominic guided me to a leather armchair near a roaring fireplace. He didn't offer me a drink, not yet. He seemed driven by a singular purpose, a nervous energy that vibrated beneath his tuxedo. He walked to the far wall of the study where a massive abstract painting hung. With a wave of his hand, the painting slid silently to the left, revealing a wall safe. It wasn't a standard dial lock. It was a biometric scanner that glowed with a soft blue light. Dominic pressed his palm against the glass. The mechanism whirred, a heavy, expensive sound of tumblers falling into place. The steel door swung open. I expected to see stacks of cash. I expected gold bars or diamonds, the kind of things tycoons kept in movies. But the safe was largely empty. In the center, sitting on a velvet shelf, was a single thick leather portfolio. It looked old. The leather was cracked and faded, worn by the passage of time. Dominic took it out with both hands, treating it with the reverence one might show a religious artifact. He walked over to me and placed the portfolio on the low table in front of my chair. He sat down opposite me, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Open it, Victor," he said softly. My hands were still trembling, not from the cold anymore, but from an exhaustion that went down to my soul. I reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover. Inside, there was no cash. There were no jewels. There was just a stack of paper. The top document was yellowed with age, the typewritten font crisp and distinct, a relic from a different era. I leaned in, squinting in the firelight. It was a stock certificate. Valenti Corporation. Preferred stock. Series A. Issued to Victor Vance. Date October 14th, 1990. I looked up at Dominic, confused. "My father issued this the day the foundation settled," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. "The day the engineers confirmed that your screw pile design was holding. He transferred 10% of the company's equity into this holding. He said that if the ghost ever returned, if the man who saved us ever came back from the shadows, this was his. He signed it, Victor. He notarized it. He put it in that safe 34 years ago, and no one has touched it since." I looked back down at the paper. 10%. In 1990, Valenti Corporation was a struggling firm on the brink of bankruptcy. 10% of nothing was nothing. Dominic reached into the portfolio and pulled out a second document. This one was modern, a crisp spreadsheet printed on high-quality bond paper. "We did not just hold the stock," Victor Dominic continued. "My father gave strict instructions. Every dividend that this stock earned over the last 3 decades was to be automatically reinvested. Every profit share, every split. We bought more stock in your name. We diversified into the holdings. We treated this portfolio as if it were the family's crown jewel." He tapped the bottom line of the spreadsheet. "This is the valuation as of the market close yesterday." I followed his finger. I saw the numbers. I blinked, sure that the fatigue was making me hallucinate. I saw a 5, an 8, and then a string of zeros that seemed to stretch on forever. $58,450,000. The number sat there on the page, black and undeniable. $58 million. The room went silent. The crackle of the fire sounded like gunshots. I stared at the paper. This was freedom. This was power. This was enough money to buy the building Preston lived in and evict him just to make a point. This was enough money to buy the construction site where I had stood freezing an hour ago. I should have smiled. I should have laughed. I should have felt the rush of victory that comes when the universe finally balances the scales. But I didn't smile. A sound tore itself from my throat. It wasn't a cheer. It was a sob. A ragged, broken noise that sounded like something vital inside me was tearing apart. My shoulders heaved. I dropped my head into my hands, and I wept. I didn't cry for the joy of the money. I cried for the cruelty of the timing. I thought of Eleanor. I thought of the last years of her life. I thought of the experimental treatment in Switzerland that we couldn't afford. I thought of the second-rate care facility where the nurses were too busy to change her sheets. I thought of the pain in her eyes that she tried to hide from me because she knew I was a retired engineer with a dwindling pension, not a tycoon. $58 million. It was sitting here in a safe while she was dying. It was gathering dust and interest while I was counting coupons and selling my tools. If I had answered the phone, if I hadn't been so proud, if I hadn't disappeared into my grief, she might be sitting here with me. She might be alive. Victor Dominic's voice was gentle, alarmed. I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face, blurring the vision of the luxury around me. "It is too late," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It is too late, Daniel. She is gone. The money, it cannot buy her back. It is just paper. It is just ash." Dominic moved from his chair to the ottoman in front of me. He grabbed my hands again. "It is not ash," he said fiercely. "It is your life. It is your legacy. It is the proof that you mattered. You saved us, Victor, and now you have to let us save you. You cannot save Eleanor, but you can save her memory. You can save yourself." I looked at the certificate again. $58 million. It came too late to save my wife from sickness, but it had arrived just in time to save my honor from my son. It was a weapon. And I was just beginning to realize I was at war. Suddenly the heavy double doors of the study opened. A man walked in. He was not security. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit carrying a thick manila file folder. He had the sharp, predatory look of a high-priced lawyer. Dominic looked up, wiping his own eyes. "Reynolds," he said. "Not now. Can't you see we are having a moment?" The lawyer Reynolds didn't apologize. He didn't back down. He walked straight to the table and placed the thick file next to the $58 million statement. "I am sorry, Mr. Valenti." Reynolds said, his voice grave. "But you asked for an immediate trace on the withdrawal Victor's son made. The $5,000 from the ATM at O'Hare." I stiffened. I wiped my face with my sleeve. I looked at the lawyer. "He is going on vacation," I muttered bitterly. "He is running away with my last dime." "No, Mr. Vance," Reynolds said. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional anger. He did not buy a plane ticket. We accessed the transaction records. He transferred the funds via an encrypted app to a private investigation firm based in the Cayman Islands. Reynolds opened the file. He spread out a series of emails and photos. "Your son didn't just steal your money to spend it," Reynolds said. "He paid someone to find something. Specifically, he paid for a rush job to dig up a sealed record from 1985. A record involving you, a structural failure in a bridge project in Ohio, and a settlement that was supposed to be buried forever." My blood ran cold. The bridge in Ohio. That was the one mistake of my career. The one secret I had kept from everyone, even Eleanor. "He isn't just kicking you out, Victor," Dominic said, his voice turning into a growl as he read the file. "He is building a case. He wants to make sure that if you ever try to fight him for the penthouse, he can destroy your reputation before you even step into a courtroom." I stared at the file. The $5,000 wasn't for a ticket. It was for a shovel. My son was using my own money to dig my grave. Reynolds flipped the page of the file, his movements precise and clinical. He did not look at me with pity anymore. He looked at me like a general briefing a soldier who had just realized he was behind enemy lines. The fire in the penthouse fireplace crackled a cozy sound that felt obscene against the cold reality spreading out on the mahogany table. "Mr. Vance Reynolds," said his voice dropping an octave. "The investigation into the $5,000 led us to a much larger, much uglier financial picture. Your son did not steal that money to go on vacation. He stole it because he is drowning." He slid a document across the table. It was a foreclosure notice. It was printed on ominous red paper stamped by the Bank of Chicago. "Preston and Tiffany are not just cash poor," Reynolds continued. "They are insolvent, completely and utterly bankrupt." I stared at the paper. I saw the address, my penthouse, the home I had bought with cash 40 years ago, the deed I had foolishly transferred to Preston's trust to avoid inheritance taxes. "They leveraged the property 3 years ago," Reynolds explained, pointing to a line of figures that made my stomach turn. "They took out a home equity line of credit for $4 million. They bet it all on speculative cryptocurrency and high-risk tech startups that evaporated last month. They have not paid the mortgage in 6 months. The bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings. They have 30 days to pay $200,000 in arrears, or the sheriff puts a padlock on the door." I sat back, the leather of the armchair creaking. It wasn't just cruelty, it was panic. They kicked me out because they needed to sell the walls around me. "But the house is not enough," Dominic added, reading over Reynolds' shoulder. "The market is soft. Even if they sell the penthouse, they will still owe millions to private creditors. They needed liquid assets. Fast." Reynolds pulled out another sheet. This one was a handwritten list. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Preston's chicken scratch scrawl, a list I used to see on his homework assignments. But this wasn't homework. It was an inventory. Item 1, Patek Philippe, 1518. Item 2, Rolex Daytona Paul Newman. Item 3, the Blueprint Collection. My breath caught in my throat. My watch collection. I had spent 40 years collecting those timepieces. Not for fashion, but for the mechanics. I loved the gears, the precision, the engineering that fit on a wrist. I had kept them in a safety deposit box at the bank, a box Preston had power of attorney over in case of emergencies. And the blueprints. My original hand-drawn schematics for the Chicago skyline. The drawings Mia had recognized. I had told Preston 1,000 times that those were for his children. For my grandchildren. They were the legacy of my mind meant to inspire the next generation of builders. "They have a buyer lined up in Dubai," Reynolds said quietly. "A private collector. They agreed to sell the watches and the drawings for pennies on the dollar. A quick sale. Cash under the table. They are scheduled to empty your safety deposit box tomorrow morning at 9. "And me," I whispered. "What was the plan for me, Reynolds?" Hesitated. He looked at Dominic, then back at me. "State care," he said. "They filed paperwork last week to have you admitted to Shady Oaks as an indigent ward of the state. It is a facility for people with no assets and no family support. It is free. If you are in there, you are not an expense. You are off the books. And with you gone and your reputation destroyed by the Ohio Bridge rumors they were paying to dig up, no one would believe you if you claimed you owned the watches." I closed my eyes. It was a perfect demolition. They had engineered the collapse of my life with the same precision I used to build skyscrapers. They would strip my assets to pay their gambling debts, bury my reputation to ensure my silence, and warehouse my body in a place where people go to die alone. It wasn't just ungrateful, it was predatory. Reynolds tapped the iPad sitting on the table. "There is one more thing, Mr. Vance, and I warn you this is difficult to watch. But you need to see the extent of what we are dealing with. Our private investigator didn't just access the bank records. He accessed the cloud server for the penthouse security system. He pushed the iPad toward me. This video was recorded at 11:35 tonight, 5 minutes after you walked out the door. I looked at the screen. The image was crisp, high definition. It showed the living room I knew so well, the Italian marble table, the view of the snowstorm outside. I saw Preston. He was sitting at the table, his head in his hands, looking at the empty chair where I had sat. He looked guilty. He looked weak. But then Tiffany walked into the frame. She wasn't crying. She wasn't worried about the blizzard that was swallowing her father-in-law. She was holding a bottle of champagne, a vintage Dom Perignon I had been saving for my 75th birthday. She popped the cork. The foam spilled over her hands, and she laughed. It was a sharp, victorious sound that cut through the speakers. She poured 2 glasses. She walked over to Preston and shoved one into his hand. "Drink up, baby," she said, her voice clear and bright. "The leech is gone. We have the house, we have the watches, we are going to survive this." Preston hesitated. He looked at the door. "He is old, Tiff," he mumbled. "It is 10 below zero. What if he freezes?" "Let him freeze," Tiffany said, taking a long sip. "It solves the nursing home problem. If he freezes, we get the life insurance policy too. It is a win-win." She laughed again. She spun around the room, dancing with her glass. She stopped in front of the mantel. There was a large oil painting hanging there. It was a portrait of Eleanor and me painted on our 40th anniversary. It was the centerpiece of the room, the heart of the home. Tiffany looked at it with a sneer. "And this," she said, "this depressing thing goes first. It clashes with the feng shui." She reached up and ripped the painting off the wall. The heavy frame crashed onto the floor. Preston flinched, but he didn't stand up. He didn't stop her. Tiffany dragged the painting toward the fireplace. The gas flames were roaring yellow and hot. "Out with the old," she screamed. She lifted the canvas. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the corner of the painting into the fire. I watched on the screen as the flames caught the oil paint. I watched Eleanor's face, painted with such love and care, begin to bubble and blacken. I watched my own face melt away. The fire consumed 40 years of marriage in seconds. Tiffany stood back, watching it burn, the firelight reflecting in her eyes like a demon. She raised her glass to the burning canvas. "Happy New Year, Victor," she whispered. Reynolds paused the video. The image froze on the burning painting and Tiffany's smiling face. The room in Dominic's penthouse was silent. The only sound was the wind howling outside far below us. I stared at the frozen image. I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't a bone. It wasn't a structural beam. It was the cord that connected me to the man I used to be. The man who forgave. The man who sacrificed. The father. That man burned up in the fireplace with Eleanor's portrait. I looked at my hands, the hands that had built towers, the hands that had drawn the bridge for Mia. They were steady now. The trembling was gone. The cold was gone. I looked up at Dominic. I looked at Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds," I said. My voice sounded different. It was deeper, harder. It sounded like the grinding of stone against stone. "Yes, Mr. Vance, execute the transfer of the shares," I said. "Liquidate the dividends. I want access to the $58 million immediately." "Consider it done," Reynolds said. "And then I want you to call the Bank of Chicago. I want you to buy the debt on the penthouse. Do not pay it off. Buy the note. Become the creditor." Dominic smiled. It was a wolf's smile. He understood. "I want to own the foreclosure," I continued. "I want to be the one who holds the padlock." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the city I had helped build. Somewhere down there in the warmth I had paid for my son, was drinking my champagne and watching my memories burn. I turned back to them. "You asked me if I wanted to call Preston," I said. "You asked if I wanted to save him." I looked at the blank screen of the iPad. "I do not have a son," I said. "I only have debtors, and I am calling in the loan." The morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse with a brilliance that felt almost aggressive. I woke up in a bed that cost more than my first car, surrounded by sheets of Egyptian cotton that felt like water against my skin. For a moment, just a fleeting heartbeat, I forgot. I forgot the snowstorm. I forgot the bus station. I forgot the image of my wife's portrait burning in the fireplace. But then I breathed in the scent of cedar and expensive coffee, and the reality crashed back down on me. I was not Victor the refugee anymore. I was Victor the millionaire, and I had work to do. Dominic was waiting for me in the main salon. He was already dressed in a suit that looked like it had been cut from midnight itself. He was on the phone speaking in low, rapid Italian, but he hung up the moment I entered. He looked me up and down. I was still wearing the clothes I had left the penthouse in, the wrinkled shirt, the suit stained with the grime of the Greyhound station. I looked like a ruin. "We have a busy day," Dominic said, putting his phone in his pocket. "Reynolds is setting up the meeting with the bank for noon. But before we walk into that room, we need to address the architecture." I looked at him confused. "The architecture?" "You, Victor," Dominic said, walking around me like he was inspecting a building foundation. "You are the structure. Right now you look like a condemned property. If we are going to war, you need to look like a general. You need to look like the ghost." He didn't take me to a department store. He took me to a private atelier on Oak Street, a place with no sign on the door, just a buzzer and a camera. The tailor, a man named Giovanni, who measured in millimeters and spoke in hushed tones, treated me not as an old man, but as a canvas. I stood on the podium while they worked. The barber came first. The hot towel on my face felt like a baptism, steaming away the dirt and the shame of the previous night. I felt the razor glide over my skin, scraping away the gray stubble, the neglect, the face of the man who had let himself be bullied by his daughter-in-law. When the chair spun around, I looked in the mirror. The man staring back was older than I remembered, yes, but the jawline was sharp. The eyes were clear. The weakness was gone. Then came the clothes. Giovanni brought out a suit of charcoal wool, hand-stitched in Milan. It wasn't just clothing, it was engineering. The shoulder pads corrected my posture. The waist suppressed the slump of age. The fabric moved with me, a second skin of armor worth $10,000. I buttoned the jacket. I adjusted the silk tie. I slid my feet into leather shoes that shone like obsidian. I looked in the full-length mirror. I didn't see the homeless man from the bus station. I didn't see the expired father. I saw the ghost. I saw the man who had saved skyscrapers from sinking. I saw a man who commanded respect, not because he asked for it, but because he was built of iron and logic. Dominic stood behind me, a smile touching his lips. "There he is," he whispered. "Welcome back, Victor." We drove to the law firm in silence. The Rolls-Royce felt different this time. Last night it was a rescue pod. Today it was a war chariot. Reynolds was waiting for us in the conference room, the file on the penthouse foreclosure spread out on the glass table. "The bank is nervous," Reynolds said without preamble. "They know the market is soft. They know Preston has destroyed the equity. They are preparing to auction the property in 30 days, but they are expecting to take a loss. They want a quick exit." He looked at me, expecting the standard instruction. "I can write a check to pay off the arrears," Reynolds suggested. $200,000 clears the immediate debt. It stops the foreclosure. It saves the house for your son. We can put it in a trust so he can't borrow against it again. It is the merciful play." I walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. I saw the building I had engineered 40 years ago. It stood tall because the foundation was honest. It stood because it understood the laws of consequences. If you put too much weight on a weak beam, it breaks. Preston was a weak beam. If I propped him up now, if I saved him with a check, he would never learn the physics of life. He would just wait for the next bailout. No, I said, turning back to the room. Reynolds paused, his pen hovering over the notepad. No, I do not want to pay the arrears, I said, my voice steady and cold. I do not want to save the house for him. Dominic leaned forward, intrigued. Then what is the play, Victor? I walked to the table and placed my hand on the foreclosure file. I want to buy the debt, I said. Reynolds blinked. Buy the debt? You mean the mortgage note? Everything I said. The first mortgage, the home equity line of credit, the penalties, the interest. I want to buy the paper from the bank. I want to step into the shoes of the lender. I looked Reynolds in the eye. I do not want to be his savior, Mr. Reynolds. I want to be his creditor. A slow smile spread across Dominic's face. It was a vicious, approving look. If you own the note, Dominic said, his voice low, you control the foreclosure. You control the timeline. You control the eviction. Exactly, I said. If the bank forecloses, it is just business. It is a faceless institution taking back an asset. Preston can blame the economy. He can blame bad luck. But if I own the note... I left the sentence unfinished. The implication hung in the air, heavy and sharp. If I owned the note, Preston would have to answer to me. He would have to negotiate with the man he called expired. He would have to beg the man he left to freeze. Reynolds typed furiously on his laptop. The bank will be delighted, Reynolds said. They get their principal back immediately. They wipe a toxic asset off their books without legal fees. They will sell us the note by end of day. He pushed a document toward me. It was a transfer of debt agreement, and next to it a check authorization form. The total amount to purchase the distressed debt is $2,100,000, Reynolds said. This covers the principal and the outstanding interest. It gives you total control over the lien on the penthouse. I took a gold fountain pen from my inside pocket. The weight of it felt good. I looked at the check. $2 million. A few days ago, this sum was unimaginable. Now it was a tactical strike. I thought about the $5,000 Preston had stolen from me. He thought he was clever. He thought he was taking my last breath. He didn't know that he had just invited a hurricane into his life. I signed the check. My signature was not the shaky scrawl of an old man. It was the sharp, angular signature of the architect who had signed the blueprints for the city. I put the pen down. The sound of it hitting the glass table was like a gavel coming down. Do it, I said. Buy the debt. And Reynolds, yes, Mr. Vance. Do not tell him yet, I said. Let him think he has 30 days. Let him think he has time to sell my watches. Let him think he has won. I want him to feel safe. I adjusted the cuffs of my $10,000 suit. Because when the ground finally falls out from under him, I said I want him to know exactly who pulled the lever. I sat in the high-back leather chair of Dominic's study, staring at the wall of monitors that Reynolds had set up. It was a command center, a digital window into the life of the son who had left me to die. The feed from the penthouse security cameras was crisp and clear. I watched Preston pacing the living room floor, biting his fingernails until they bled. Tiffany was on the sofa, surrounded by unpaid bills, her face a mask of crumbling vanity. They looked like rats on a sinking ship, waiting for the water to reach their necks. It was time to throw them a lifeline made of lead. Dominic stood beside me, checking his watch. It is time, Victor, he said. Sterling is in the elevator. Sterling was not a lawyer. He was an actor, a man Dominic used for high-stakes negotiations, where charm was more effective than threats. He looked the part of a high-end acquisitions agent dressed in a beige linen suit, that suggested old money and zero stress. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Preston's car. I watched on the screen as the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor. Sterling stepped out and adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. He rang the doorbell. It was a confident, authoritative ring. Inside the apartment, Preston jumped. He looked terrified. He thought it was the sheriff serving the eviction notice. He signaled Tiffany to be quiet. He crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Seeing a well-dressed stranger instead of a uniform, he opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" Preston asked, his voice cracking with stress. "Mr. Preston Vance Sterling," asked, his voice smooth as velvet. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I represent a private investment consortium specializing in ultra-luxury redevelopment." "May I come in?" Preston hesitated, but greed is a powerful reflex. He opened the door. Sterling walked in and looked around the apartment. He ignored the empty space on the wall where Eleanor's portrait used to hang. He ignored the packing boxes in the corner. He walked to the window and looked out at the view. "Magnificent," Sterling murmured. "Truly magnificent. The feng shui of this location is unparalleled. The energy flow from the lake is exactly what my client is looking for." Tiffany stood up, smoothing her dress. "Who is your client?" she asked, sensing money in the air. "I am afraid I cannot disclose that," Sterling said, turning to face them. "He is a very private individual, a man of significant means who collects properties with specific energy signatures. He wants to expand this penthouse. He wants to buy the unit below and combine them into a duplex palace." He paused, letting the hook dangle. "We know the market is soft, Mr. Vance. We know properties in this building are sitting for months. But my client is impatient. He wants this unit, and he wants it now." "How much?" Tiffany blurted out. Sterling smiled. "We are prepared to make an all-cash offer. No financing contingencies. Closing in 48 hours. We are offering $2.5 million. I watched Preston's knees buckle. I saw Tiffany grab the edge of the sofa to steady herself. $2.5 million. It was a lifeline. It was salvation. It was $1 million over the market value. It would pay off the arrears to the bank. It would pay off the gambling debts. It would leave them with cash in their pockets. "We accept," Preston gasped. "Where do we sign?" Sterling held up a hand. "Not so fast. There is a condition, a non-negotiable condition." The room went silent. I leaned closer to the monitor. This was the trap. "My client is extremely superstitious," Sterling said, his face dead serious. "He believes deeply in the spiritual cleanliness of a title. He knows that this apartment was originally purchased by your father, Victor Vance. He knows that the deed was transferred to you, but he believes that the patriarch's energy is still tied to the foundation." Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was thick, cream-colored stationery. "To release the funds, my client requires a spiritual severance. He needs Victor Vance to sign this document. It is a voluntary waiver of inheritance and residency. It essentially states that he leaves the home of his own free will with no ill will and blesses the sale. Without his signature, my client believes the property is cursed. No signature, no deal." Tiffany's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks as the reality hit her. They needed me. The man they had thrown into a blizzard. The man they hoped was freezing to death in a gutter. They needed my hand to sign the paper that would save their lives. "But my father," Preston stammered. "He isn't here right now. He is traveling." Sterling checked his watch. "That is unfortunate. My client's offer expires at midnight tonight. If you cannot produce the signature, by then we move on to the penthouse in the Trump Tower." He placed the document on the table and handed Preston a business card. "You have 6 hours," Sterling said. "Good luck." He walked out. The door clicked shut. On the screen, chaos erupted. Tiffany started screaming. She ran to the window as if she could spot me in the streets below. Preston was pacing in circles, pulling at his hair. "Where is he?" Tiffany shrieked. "Where did the old fool go?" "I don't know," Preston yelled back. "We kicked him out." "He could be dead," "Call him," Tiffany commanded. "Call his cell phone." "He won't answer," Preston said. "I stole his last $5,000. He hates us." "Call him," she screamed, throwing a cushion at him. "Tell him anything. Tell him we are sorry. Tell him we made a mistake. Tell him we love him. Just get him back here to sign that paper." I watched Preston pull out his phone. My own phone, sitting on the mahogany table next to my elbow, began to vibrate. The name on the screen said, "Son." I looked at Dominic. He nodded. It was time for the performance of a lifetime. I cleared my throat. I slumped in the chair, letting my body relax into a posture of defeat. I closed my eyes and summoned the cold of the bus station. I remembered the hunger. I made my hands shake as I reached for the phone. I answered on the fourth ring. "Hello," I whispered. My voice was weak, trembling, the voice of a broken man. "Dad." Preston's voice was frantic. "Dad. Oh, thank God. Are you okay? Where are you?" I let a long, wheezing breath escape my lips. "Preston," I said, my voice barely audible. "Is that you? I am so cold, son." "Dad, listen to me," Preston said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We made a terrible mistake. We were stressed. We didn't mean it. We have been looking for you all night." "Where are you?" I paused. I let the silence stretch until I knew his heart was hammering. "I am under the Wacker Drive bridge," I lied. "It is the only dry place. I am sitting on cardboard. I haven't eaten in 2 days, Preston. I am so hungry." I heard Tiffany in the background. "Is he alive?" "Get him here, Dad, please," Preston said. "Come home. We want you to come home. We miss you. The apartment. It isn't a home without you. We were wrong. Please, just come back. We will take care of you." I sniffled. It was a pathetic sound. "You want me back? After you burned the painting?" "We didn't mean it," Tiffany yelled, grabbing the phone from Preston. Her voice was pure syrup, sweet and poisonous. "Daddy, it's Tiffany. I was having a breakdown. I love that painting. I love you. Please just come home. I will make you soup. I will make your favorite tomato soup. Just come back to us." Soup. That was the offer. They were selling the roof over my head for $2 million, and they were offering me a bowl of soup to facilitate the transaction. I looked at the $58 million statement on the desk. I looked at the foreclosure notice. I looked at the wolves on the screen masquerading as sheep. "Okay," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Okay. I will come home. I just want to be warm." "Yes," Tiffany cried out. "Yes, come home. Hurry, we will be waiting. We have a surprise for you." She hung up. On the screen, I saw them high-five. I saw them hug. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was stupid enough to walk back into the trap. I set the phone down. I sat up straight. The weakness vanished from my body. I adjusted the cuffs of my $10,000 suit. I looked at Dominic. "The car is ready," Dominic said. "Reynolds has the paperwork for the debt purchase. We own the mortgage, Victor. We own the foreclosure rights." "Good," I said. I stood up. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. I didn't see a victim. I saw the executioner. "Let's go get some soup," I said. We walked to the elevator. The game was over. It was time for the slaughter. I stood in the service elevator of the building I had built, checking my reflection in the polished steel doors. I had left the Italian suit, the handmade shoes, and the gold watch in the trunk of Dominic S. Rolls-Royce, which was currently parked 3 blocks away in the shadows. I was once again wearing the stained, wrinkled suit I had worn to the bus station. I had rubbed a little dirt on my face and messed up my hair. I needed to look like a man who had spent 48 hours sleeping under a bridge. I needed to look like a victim. When the elevator doors opened on the penthouse floor, the smell hit me first. It was the rich, savory scent of roasted chicken and tomato basil soup. It was the smell of home, the smell of safety. It was the bait. I shuffled toward the heavy oak door, my posture stooped, my steps heavy and dragging. I rang the bell. The door flew open instantly, as if they had been standing right behind it, holding their breath. "Daddy!" Tiffany screamed the word. It was a high-pitched theatrical sound that grated on my ears. She threw herself at me, wrapping her arms around my dirty coat without a second of hesitation. She smelled of expensive perfume and desperate greed. "Oh, thank God, Preston, come here, he is alive." Preston appeared in the hallway. He looked terrible. His eyes were red, his shirt was untucked. He saw me, and for a second I saw genuine relief in his eyes. But then I saw his gaze flick down to my hands, to see if I was holding anything, to see if I was broken enough to be managed. "Dad." He rushed forward and hugged us both. It was a family embrace, a tableau of love and reconciliation. If I were watching it from the outside, I might have cried. But I was on the inside, and I could feel Preston's heart hammering against my chest, not with love, but with the adrenaline of a gambler who just realized he might win the hand. Come in, you are freezing." They ushered me into the living room. The fireplace was roaring. The spot on the wall where Eleanor S.'s portrait had hung was empty, a glaring white rectangle that screamed of their crime, but they ignored it, and so did I. They guided me to the head of the table. It was set with the fine china, the silver cutlery usually reserved for Thanksgiving. There was a steaming bowl of tomato soup waiting for me. "Sit down, Dad, please eat," Preston said, pulling out my chair. We were so worried. We called every hospital. We called the police. We thought we lost you. I sat down. I let my hands shake as I picked up the spoon. I ate the soup, ravenously, spilling a little on my chin, letting them see the hunger I had described on the phone. "I was so cold, Preston," I whispered between spoonfuls. "The wind, it goes right through you down there." "I know, Dad." "I know," Preston said, tears welling up in his eyes. He reached across the table and took my hand. His palm was sweaty. "We made a mistake, Dad. A terrible stress-induced mistake. The market, the debts, we just snapped. But losing you, that showed us what really matters." I looked at him. My son. He was crying and lying at the same time. It was a skill I did not know he possessed. "We want to make it right," Tiffany said, filling my glass with water. "We want you to be safe. We want you to be taken care of forever." I finished the soup. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a long sigh of exhaustion. "I just want to rest," I said. "I just want to sleep in my bed." Preston and Tiffany exchanged a quick, sharp look. This was the pivot point. This was the moment of the cell. "About that, Dad," Preston said, his voice dropping to a gentle, soothing tone. "We have been thinking. This apartment, it is big, it is drafty. And with your health, walking around the city confused, maybe it is not the safest place for you anymore." I blinked, looking at him with feigned confusion. "Not safe." "We found a place," Tiffany jumped in, her voice bright and enthusiastic. "A wonderful place. It is called Shady Oaks Elite. It is a 5-star facility, Dad. They have heated floors, they have chefs, they have nurses 24 hours a day. It is like a resort." Shady Oaks, the state-run facility she had threatened me with 2 days ago. The place known for bedsores and neglect. Now suddenly, it was a resort. "We pulled some strings," Preston said. "We used our connections. We got you a VIP suite. But to get you in, to secure the spot before someone else takes it, we need to process the paperwork tonight. Right now. Tiffany reached under the table and pulled out a leather folder. She opened it and slid a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper across the marble. It was the document Sterling had given them, the voluntary waiver of inheritance and residency. It is just a formality, Tiffany said, smiling her shark smile. It just tells the state that you are voluntarily moving to the luxury facility so they can release your insurance benefits. It is standard. Just a residency transfer. I looked at the paper. I pretended to squint. I reached into my pocket and put on my cracked reading glasses. I read the text. It was brutal. It was absolute. By signing this, I was declaring that I had no claim to the penthouse, no claim to the contents, and that I was vacating the premises immediately and permanently of my own free will. It says, "Waiver of inheritance," I mumbled, tracing the words with a shaking finger. "That is just legal jargon for the insurance," Preston said quickly, too quickly. "It means you are inheriting the new suite. It protects your spot. Trust us, Dad." "Do you trust me?" He looked me in the eye. The boy I had taught to ride a bike. The boy I had taught to use a slide rule. He was looking me in the eye and selling me into oblivion so he could cash a check. I looked at Tiffany. She was practically vibrating with anticipation. She was already spending the money in her head. "I trust you, son," I whispered. "I am tired. I just want to be taken care of." "Then sign," Preston said, handing me a heavy gold pen. "Sign and everything will be okay." I took the pen. I held it over the paper. I let my hand tremble violently. The tip of the pen hovered over the signature line, tapping rhythmically against the paper. Click, click, click. I looked up one last time. "You promise?" I asked. "You promise this is for the best, it is the only way, Dad?" Preston said. I lowered the pen. I scrawled my name. Victor Vance. The signature was shaky weak, the writing of a defeated man. The moment the last letter was formed. Tiffany moved. She didn't reach out gently. She snatched the paper from under my hand with the speed of a cobra striking. She pulled it to her chest and looked at the signature, her eyes wide and wild. "Done," she breathed. "It is done." She stood up. The smile vanished. The warmth vanished. The mask fell away so fast it was almost audible. She looked at the paper, then she looked at me. Her face twisted into a sneer of absolute triumph and disgust. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice ice cold. She walked to the sideboard and picked up her phone. She typed a quick message, probably to Sterling, probably to the investors she thought were waiting with a suitcase of cash. Preston sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wall. "Well," he said, his voice flat. "That is that." I looked around, confused, keeping up the act. "Can I go to my room now?" I asked. "I am so sleepy." Tiffany laughed. It was a harsh barking sound. "Your room? You don't have a room here, Victor. You just signed it away. Did you not read the legal jargon?" She waved the paper in the air like a trophy. "You waived your residency. You waived your rights. You don't live here. You are trespassing." "But the resort," I stammered. "Shady Oaks Elite." She rolled her eyes. "It is a nursing home, Victor. It is a state warehouse for old people nobody wants. And guess what? The van is downstairs. I called them an hour ago. They are waiting at the service entrance." She pointed to the door, the same door I had walked through 10 minutes ago as a father. "Get out," she said. "Take your dirty suit and get out of my house. The orderlies are waiting to strap you in. You are their problem now." Preston finally looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes anymore. Just a cold pragmatism. "It is better this way, Dad," he said. You need professional help. We can't care for you. Please just go quietly. Don't make a scene." I stood up. I didn't shake. I didn't tremble. I looked at my son. I looked at his wife. I looked at the luxury that surrounded them, the luxury I had built. I buttoned my dirty jacket. "I won't make a scene, Preston," I said, my voice suddenly steady, suddenly clear. I walked to the door. I opened it. I didn't look back. "Enjoy the soup," I said. I stepped out into the hallway, and the door clicked shut behind me, locking them in. Locking them into the trap they had just set for themselves. I walked to the elevator not as a victim, but as the man who was about to pull the lever. The van downstairs wasn't for me. It was for them, they just didn't know it yet. The morning sun glinted off the glass facade of the Valenti Corporation headquarters, a monolith of steel that pierced the Chicago skyline. To Tiffany and Preston, the building didn't look like a place of business. It looked like a bank vault waiting to be cracked. They walked through the revolving doors with the swagger of people who had just won the lottery. Tiffany was wearing her best fur coat, the one she hadn't paid off yet, and Preston had shaved and put on a tie, trying to hide the red-rimmed eyes of a man who had sold his father for a wire transfer. They approached the front desk. They gave their names. They were expected. A young assistant with a headset guided them to the private elevator, the one that only went to the top floor. The ride up was silent, filled with the electricity of greed. I could imagine the conversation they had in the car. What they would buy first. Which debts they would clear. How they would celebrate the final erasure of Victor Vance from their lives. When the doors opened on the executive level, Arthur Sterling was waiting for them. He was still in character, the perfect picture of the high-end acquisitions agent. He smiled, a shark baring its teeth, and shook Preston's hand. "Right this way," Sterling said smoothly. "My client is waiting in the main boardroom. The funds are ready for transfer. We just need to finalize the title handover." They followed him down a long corridor lined with modern art and awards for engineering excellence. They walked past models of bridges and towers, never realizing that the man they had thrown into the snow had designed half of them. They reached the double doors at the end of the hall. Sterling opened them and ushered them inside. The boardroom was massive. A long table of polished black granite stretched out like a runway. At the far end, facing the panoramic window that overlooked the frozen city, was a high-backed leather chair. It was turned away from the door. A curl of blue smoke rose from behind the chair, drifting lazily toward the ceiling. Dominic Valenti stood by the window looking out at the snow. He turned as they entered. He didn't smile. He looked at them with the cold, dispassionate gaze of an emperor watching gladiators enter the arena. Mr. Valenti, Preston stammered, recognizing the face from magazines. I didn't know the buyer was you. This is an honor." Dominic didn't answer. He just gestured toward the empty chairs at the far end of the table. "Sit down," he said. Tiffany and Preston sat. They looked nervous now. The room was too quiet. The air was too cold. They looked at the back of the leather chair. The smoke continued to rise. "We brought the deed." Tiffany said, her voice a little too loud, trying to fill the silence. "And the waiver. Victor signed it last night. He is being taken care of." The chair creaked. Slowly, deliberately, it began to swivel. The movement was smooth, hydraulic, and terrifyingly slow. As the chair turned, the figure sitting in it came into view. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an anonymous investor. It was me. I was wearing the $10,000 charcoal suit from the Italian atelier. My hair was trimmed and styled. My face was clean-shaven, smelling of sandalwood and vengeance. In my hand, I held a lit cigar, the smoke curling around my fingers like a tame spirit. I looked at them. I didn't look like the shivering, broken old man who had eaten their soup 12 hours ago. I looked like a titan. "Hello, children," I said. My voice was deep resonant, stripped of the feigned weakness of the night before. I took a slow drag from the cigar and exhaled, watching the smoke drift across the table toward them. I heard you want to sell my house. Preston stopped breathing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me, then at the door, then back at me, his brain unable to reconcile the image of the beggar he had evicted with the tycoon sitting before him. Tiffany let out a strangled gasp. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "No," she whispered. "No. That is impossible. You are at the nursing home." The van came. I saw the van. The van came for a ghost, I said calmly. And ghosts are very hard to catch. Reynolds stepped out from the shadows in the corner of the room. He walked to the table and dropped a heavy file in front of them. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Mr. Vance is not the person selling the house," Reynolds said, his voice cutting through their shock. "He is the person who bought it. Or rather, he bought you." Preston looked down at the file. He saw the transfer of debt agreement. He saw the check for $2.1 million signed by me. He saw the foreclosure authorization. "What is this?" Preston wheezed. "We bought your debt, Preston," I said. "Every cent of it. The mortgage, the credit lines, the interest. I am not your father right now. I am the bank, and you are in default." "But," the offer, Tiffany stammered, looking at Sterling. "The $2.5 million. The cash." Sterling stepped forward. He wasn't smiling anymore. "There is no offer, Mrs. Vance. I was never representing a consortium. I was representing Victor. We needed to see how far you would go. We needed to see if you would really sell your father's home for a quick payout." "And you did," Dominic added, his voice dripping with disgust. "You sold him for soup." Reynolds tapped the document on the table. "And this paper," Reynolds said. "The waiver you forced him to sign last night. You thought it was your golden ticket. You thought it cleared the title." Reynolds opened the folder and pointed to a clause highlighted in yellow. "But what you actually created is evidence. This document proves that you knowingly coerced a man you believed to be homeless, starving, and mentally compromised into signing away his rights under duress. In the state of Illinois, that is called elder abuse. It is called extortion. And because you did it to facilitate a fraudulent real estate transaction, it is also a felony." Preston slumped in his chair. He slid down until his chin hit his chest. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He realized in that moment that the trap he had built for me had snapped shut on his own neck. "Dad," he whispered. Why, I stood up. I walked around the table until I was standing right behind them. I placed my hands on the back of Preston's chair. "Because you stole $5,000 from me," I said softly. "Because you burned your mother's painting. Because you looked me in the eye, Preston, and you lied to me while I ate your soup. You didn't just break my heart. You broke the contract of fatherhood." I walked over to Tiffany. She was shaking. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. "It cannot be!" she screeched, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You are broke. You are nothing. You are just a useless old man. We checked your accounts. You have zero," I laughed. It was a dark, rich sound. "I had zero in the account you knew about," I said. "But you didn't know about 1990. You didn't know about the tower I saved. You didn't know about the $58 million sitting in a vault while you were trying to sell my watches to a fence in Dubai. 58 million. The number hit Tiffany like a physical blow. Her eyes rolled back in her head for a second. She grabbed the table to keep from fainting. 58 million, she gasped. I leaned in close. I could smell the fear on her. "Yes, Tiffany, and not a single penny of it will ever touch your hand." Reynolds picked up the phone on the conference table. "Security," Reynolds said. "Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Vance out of the building. and notify the sheriff to execute the eviction order on the penthouse immediately. They have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Preston fell out of his chair. He hit the floor with a thud, kneeling on the carpet, clutching at the leg of the table. He was crying now, real ugly tears of total ruin. "Dad, please," he begged. "We have nowhere to go. We have nothing." I looked down at him. I remembered the bus station. I remembered the cold. I remembered the feeling of being debris. "Then you should go to the Greyhound station," I said coldly. "I hear the sandwiches are free if you find the right person." Tiffany screamed. It was a primal sound of rage and loss. "You can't do this!" she yelled as the security guards dragged her toward the door. "We are your family." I turned my back on them. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, my city. "I don't have a family," I said to the glass. "I only have tenants, and their lease has expired." The heavy file folder hit the polished granite table with a sound that cracked through the silence of the boardroom like a thunderclap. It was not just paper hitting stone. It was the sound of a judge's gavel coming down on a life sentence. Preston flinched on the floor, curling into himself, as if I had physically struck him. Tiffany stopped screaming, her mouth snapping shut, as she stared at the thick stack of documents that Reynolds had just laid out like a royal flush. I looked down at them. My voice was no longer the roar of a titan. It was quiet, deadly calm, the voice of a structural engineer explaining why a building had to be condemned. "You have two choices," I said, looking from my son to his wife. "And because I am a generous man, the same man who gave you a penthouse and an education, I am going to let you pick your poison." I pointed a finger at the file. "Option 1 is prison," I said. "Reynolds has already drafted the criminal complaint. We have the video of you burning my wife's portrait. We have the text messages where you planned to dump me at a state facility. We have the waiver you forced me to sign while I was pretending to be starving and confused. That is elder abuse, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Reynolds nodded, his face grim. With the amount of money involved, Reynolds added, looking at Tiffany and the premeditated nature of the act, "You are looking at 10 to 15 years. Minimum. And in federal prison, Tiffany, there is no room for a yoga studio." Tiffany let out a small, strangled whimper. She looked at her hands, the hands that had poured champagne to celebrate my death. She was imagining them in handcuffs. "Option 2. I continued, my eyes hard as flint. "You leave right now. You walk out of this building with the clothes on your backs. You surrender the keys to the penthouse. You surrender the access codes. You sign a confession admitting to the coercion which I will keep in my safe. If you ever come near me again, if you ever try to contact the media, if you ever breathe my name in public, I release the confession to the district attorney." I leaned over the table, looming over them. "You leave with nothing," I said. "No assets, no furniture, no watches, no paintings. You leave as empty as you made me feel when you pushed me out into the snow." The room was silent for a heartbeat. I watched the gears turning in Tiffany's head. She was a survivor. She was a parasite. And parasites know when the host is dead. She looked at Preston, who was still weeping on the floor, clutching the table leg like a drowning man. The look in her eyes changed. The panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, reptilian calculation. "It was him," Tiffany blurted out. Preston stopped crying. He looked up, confused, snot running down his nose. What, he croaked. "It was Preston," Tiffany screamed, pointing a manicured finger at her husband. "It was his idea, Victor. He told me the accounts were empty. He told me we had to sell the house. He made me burn the painting. He said it was the only way to move on." I was scared. I just did what he told me. I am a victim here, too. I watched her with a mixture of disgust and fascination. She was throwing him to the wolves to save her own skin. She was willing to send the father of her non-existent children to prison if it meant she could walk away. Preston yelled, scrambling to his feet. "You lit the match, you poured the champagne, You called the nursing home." He turned to me, his hands clasped in prayer. "Dad, don't listen to her. She is lying. She spent all the money. The crypto, the trips, it was all her. She drove us into debt. I just wanted to make her happy. I am your son, Dad. Your blood. You can't let her do this to me." I looked at them. They were tearing each other apart. The perfect couple. The socialites. They were nothing but scavengers fighting over a carcass. "Enough," I said. The word silenced them both. I walked around the table until I stood directly in front of Preston. I looked into his eyes. I searched for the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. I searched for the young man I had sent to college, but they were gone. All I saw was a weak man who had let greed rot his soul. "I have spent 40 years building things, Preston," I said softly. "I have built towers that scrape the sky. I have built bridges that span rivers. I know concrete. I know steel. And I know foundations." I placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, hoping for a hug, hoping for forgiveness. "I know when a foundation is solid," I said, "and I know when it is rotten. When you find a rotten foundation, you do not patch it. You do not paint over it. You dig it out. You destroy it before it brings the whole house down." I pushed him away. He stumbled back, hitting the wall. "You are the rot, Preston," I said. "You and your wife. You are the structural failure in my life. And I am condemning the building." I turned to the security guards who had been waiting silently by the doors. They stepped forward, massive men in dark suits who looked like they could move walls. "Get them out of my sight," I ordered. The guards moved instantly. One grabbed Preston by the arm. The other took Tiffany. "Wait," Tiffany shrieked, digging her heels into the expensive carpet. My coat. My fur coat is in the cloakroom. "It cost $50,000. That coat was bought with my money," I said, turning my back on her. "It stays. You can walk into the cold just like I did. Maybe it will teach you character." They dragged them toward the door. Preston was sobbing, calling out my name, begging for a second chance, begging for a loan, begging for anything. Tiffany was screaming obscenities, cursing me, cursing Dominic, showing her true face until the very end. The heavy double doors slammed shut, cutting off their noise. The silence that followed was heavy ringing in my ears. I stood there for a moment staring at the closed doors. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was the feeling of a weight being cut loose. I had just amputated my own family. It was a necessary surgery, but the phantom limb would ache for the rest of my life. Dominic walked over to the sideboard and poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He walked to me and pressed it into my hand. "To new foundations," Dominic said quietly. I took the glass. I looked at the amber liquid. I looked at Reynolds, who was gathering the files, closing the book on my son's life. "Reynolds," I said. "Yes, Mr. Vance, change the locks on the penthouse immediately," I said. "And hire a crew. I want everything they touched removed. The furniture, the clothes, the curtains. Burn it or donate it. I don't care. I want the apartment stripped down to the bare walls." I took a sip of the whiskey. It burned a clean, sharp fire that chased away the last of the chill from the bus station. "I want to see the bones of the house again," I said. "I want to build something new, something that will last." Reynolds nodded and left the room to execute the order. I walked to the window and looked out at Chicago. The snow had stopped. The sun was shining on the frozen lake, turning the ice into a sheet of blinding diamonds. I touched the cold glass. I was alone. My wife was gone. My son was gone. But I was still standing. I was Victor Vance. I was the ghost, and I had $58 million and a city to rebuild. I turned to Dominic. "Where is the girl?" I asked. "Mia. She is in the guest suite," Dominic said. "She is sleeping. We recovered her laptop this morning. My security team found it at a pawn shop 2 blocks from the bus station. Her project is safe." "Good," I said. "Wake her up. We have work to do." "What kind of work?" Dominic asked, smiling. I pointed to the skyline, to the empty space next to the Millennium Tower. "We are going to build her bridge," I said. "And then we are going to build something for the people who have nowhere to go when the wind blows. We are going to build a sanctuary." I finished the drink and set the glass down on the table. The judgment was passed. The sentence was executed. It was time to stop being a victim and start being an architect again. "Let's go to work, Daniel," I said. The penthouse sold in 3 days. The market was soft, the real estate agents said, but a property with that view and that pedigree does not stay listed for long when the price is aggressive. I stood in the empty living room for the last time, listening to the silence. The furniture was gone. The curtains were gone. The spot above the fireplace where Eleanor's portrait had burned was just a patch of soot-stained marble now. I didn't clean it. I wanted the new owners to paint over it. I wanted every trace of the Vance family erased from these walls. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the frozen lake. A month ago, I had stood here feeling like a king. 2 weeks ago, I had been thrown out of this very room like garbage. Now I was leaving of my own accord. I held the check for the sale in my pocket. It was a staggering amount, millions of dollars that Preston would have killed for. But to me, it was just paper. It was just fuel. I didn't want the penthouse. I didn't want the memories of a son who looked at me and saw an expiration date. I wanted a clean slate. I turned my back on the view, walked out the front door, and left the keys on the counter. I didn't look back. The next morning, I met Dominic and Reynolds in the boardroom. I placed the check from the house sale on the table next to the $58 million from the stock liquidation. "It is time to build," I said. We didn't start a hedge fund. We didn't buy yachts. We filed the paperwork for the Vance and Valenti Foundation. It was a partnership born in the cold of a bus station and the warmth of a promise kept. The mission statement was simple. We would build sanctuaries. We bought the abandoned lot 3 blocks from the Greyhound station. It was an eyesore, a place where the city dumped its snow and its problems. I put on a hard hat again. I rolled up the sleeves of my $10,000 suit. I smelled the sawdust and the wet concrete, and for the first time in years, I felt young. We designed a residential complex, not a shelter, but a home. We built micro-apartments with heated floors and large windows. We built a communal kitchen that smelled of rosemary and garlic, not bleach and despair. We built a library stocked with real books. This was for the seniors, the people the city called indigent, the people families like mine called expired. We gave them keys. We gave them dignity. We gave them a place where they would never, ever freeze. And for the young, for the dreamers like Mia, who had the talent, but not the tuition, we created the Iron Ring Scholarship. We fully funded 50 architecture students in the first year alone. We paid for their laptops. We paid for their meals. We made sure that no future builder would ever have to sleep on a bench because they were too poor to afford a ticket home. Mia was our first recipient. She didn't just pass her thesis. She crushed it. With the modifications we made that night on the back of the flyer, her Infinity Bridge design won the National Student Architectural Award. She stood on the stage holding the trophy, and she didn't thank the Academy. She thanked the ghost she met in the snow. The months passed in a blur of concrete and ribbon cuttings. I didn't hear from Preston. Reynolds told me he was working at a car wash in the suburbs, living in a studio apartment that cost less than his old shoe budget. Tiffany had filed for divorce the moment the money ran out and was reportedly looking for a new host in Miami. I didn't care. They were structural failures I had excavated from my life. And then the calendar turned. It was December 31st. 1 year to the day since I had walked into the blizzard. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy, coating Chicago in a blanket of white silence. But this time I wasn't walking through it. I was sitting at a long oak table in the center of the new community hall we had built. The fire was roaring in the massive stone hearth I had designed myself. The room was filled with the smell of roasted turkey chestnuts and laughter. Around the table sat 50 people. There were the residents of the sanctuary, men and women who had been invisible a year ago, now dressed in clean clothes, their faces bright with the warmth of belonging. There was Mia sitting next to me, showing me the blueprints for her first real commission. There was Dominic pouring wine, looking happier in a cardigan than he ever had in a tuxedo. I looked at the clock. 11:55. 5 minutes to midnight. The memories of the last New Year's Eve tried to creep in. The sound of the brochure hitting the table, the look in Tiffany's eyes, the cold. But they couldn't find purchase here. This room was too full of heat. Dominic tapped his glass with a spoon. The room went quiet. He stood up and looked at me. A year ago, Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion, I found a man sitting on a bench with $42 in his pocket. He told me he was debris. He told me he was finished. He raised his glass. But a foundation does not expire. It just waits for the right weight. To Victor. The man who saved my company 30 years ago and saved my soul this year. To Victor, the room roared. Mia stood up next. She didn't raise a glass. She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was strong, the grip of an architect. To the man who taught me that impossible is just an engineering problem, she said. To the man who picked me up when I was down. She looked me in the eye. To my father, she whispered, not by blood, but by bond. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief. It was a tear of release. For 40 years, I thought fatherhood was about biology. I thought it was about providing, about paying bills, about passing down a name. I thought I had failed because my own blood had rejected me. But looking around this table, looking at the faces of the people I had helped, the people who had helped me, I realized the truth. Family isn't whose DNA you share. Family isn't who you inherit from. Family are the people who spot you in the storm. Family are the people who see value in you when the rest of the world sees ruin. Family are the people who would never, ever let you freeze. I stood up. I held my glass of champagne. My hand was steady. My heart was full. I looked at the clock. 10 seconds to midnight. I thought about the man I was a year ago. The ghost. The victim. He was gone. He had died in the snow so that this man could be born. 3 seconds. 2. 1. Happy New Year, I said, my voice strong and clear. I drank the champagne. It tasted like victory. It tasted like home. I was 73 years old. I had lost a wife, I had lost a son, I had lost a penthouse. But as the cheers erupted around me and the warmth of the fire settled into my bones, I knew one thing for certain. I was not expired. I was just getting started. Victor's journey is a powerful reminder that family isn't defined by DNA, but by loyalty and respect. For 40 years, Victor thought his value lay in what he could provide. But when he was stripped of his penthouse and his pride, he discovered his true worth wasn't in his bank account, it was in his character. His own blood saw an expiration date, while strangers saw a legend. Remember when toxic people try to discard you like debris you do not have to break? You can rebuild. You can walk away. Never let anyone else determine your value. You are the architect of your own life. If you believe that loyalty is thicker than blood, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to remember their own worth today.